Seattle, Washington, 2007. The man who couldn't stop thinking about revenge. Most people think revenge begins with anger, but psychologists have discovered something far more dangerous. Revenge rarely begins with anger. It begins with a wound that refuses to heal, a wound that keeps asking the same question: why did this happen to me? And sometimes that question becomes a prison. This is the story of Daniel Harris, a man who spent years feeding a single thought, and how that thought slowly took control of his life. In 2007, Daniel Harris was 38 years old. He lived in Seattle with his wife Lisa and their young daughter. To most people, Daniel looked successful. He managed large construction projects, owned a comfortable home, had a respected reputation, and enjoyed something many people spend their entire lives searching for: stability. Coworkers trusted him, clients respected him, friends described him as dependable, the kind of man who always kept his word, the kind of man who believed hard work eventually paid off. For most of his life, that belief had served him well. Several years earlier, Daniel had formed a business partnership with a man named Michael Reed. The two men worked together on multiple construction projects. At first, their relationship appeared strong. They shared responsibilities, shared risks, shared success. Daniel trusted Michael, not just professionally, personally, and that trust would eventually become the most expensive mistake of his life. One rainy afternoon, everything changed. Daniel received a phone call. At first, he thought it was a misunderstanding. Then he thought it was a mistake. Then he realized it was real. Several major contracts had disappeared. Financial records no longer matched. Clients had suddenly changed sides. And Michael Reed was nowhere to be found. Within a matter of weeks, Daniel's business collapsed. Years of work vanished. Years of effort disappeared. Years of trust shattered. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt something he had never felt before: betrayed. For weeks, Daniel searched for answers. He wanted an explanation, a reason, an apology, anything, but none of it came. And somewhere inside his mind, a new thought quietly appeared. Small, simple, dangerous. A thought that would follow him for years. A thought that would eventually become an obsession. A thought that sounded like this: one day, I'll make him pay. When people talk about revenge, they often imagine action, a confrontation, a plan, a dramatic moment. But psychologists have discovered something surprising. The most dangerous part of revenge usually happens long before any action. It happens inside the mind. Because revenge rarely begins as a decision. It begins as a thought. And thoughts can be incredibly powerful, especially when they arrive during moments of pain. In the months following the collapse of his business, Daniel Harris struggled to understand what had happened. Every morning he woke up with the same feeling: confusion. Every night he went to bed with the same question: why? Why would Michael do this? Why throw away years of friendship? Why destroy everything they built together? Why betray someone who trusted him? At first, Daniel searched for answers. He reviewed contracts, financial statements, emails, meeting notes, looking for something that would make the situation understandable, something that would make it hurt less. But no answer ever felt satisfying. And that is one of the most difficult things about betrayal. The human brain wants closure. It wants explanations. It wants meaning. When those things are missing, the mind often fills the empty space itself. Around this time, Daniel noticed something changing inside him. Not outside, inside. The betrayal was no longer an event. It had become a permanent conversation. A conversation happening inside his head, while driving, while working, while eating dinner, while trying to sleep. Michael's name kept returning, again and again and again. Sometimes Daniel imagined confronting him. Sometimes he imagined exposing him. Sometimes he imagined Michael finally admitting what he had done. And in every version of the story, Daniel won. For a few moments, those fantasies felt good. They felt satisfying. They felt fair. But when the fantasy ended, the pain always returned. And often, it returned stronger than before. Psychologists call this rumination, the repetitive process of thinking about the same painful event over and over again. Many people believe rumination helps solve problems. In reality, it often does the opposite, because rumination doesn't move the mind forward. It keeps the mind trapped in the past. Daniel didn't know that. He believed he was processing what happened. He believed he was searching for justice. But slowly, something else was happening. His identity was changing. For most of his life, Daniel had thought of himself as a builder, a husband, a father, a professional. Now another identity was forming. The betrayed man. And the more he thought about the betrayal, the stronger that identity became. His wife Lisa noticed the change first. At dinner, Daniel seemed distracted. While watching television, his mind wandered. Even during family activities, he often appeared distant, physically present, mentally somewhere else. Lisa tried to help. She encouraged him to move forward, to focus on the future, to rebuild. But Daniel wasn't ready to hear those words, because deep down, moving forward felt wrong. Moving forward felt like letting Michael win. And that's where the trap began. Without realizing it, Daniel had connected healing with surrender. If he stopped thinking about the betrayal, it felt like he was accepting it. If he let go of his anger, it felt like he was excusing it. If he focused on his future, it felt like he was forgetting what happened. And so he kept thinking. Every day, every week, every month, the thought became a habit. The habit became a routine. The routine became part of his identity. Years later, behavioral analyst Sarah Mitchell would describe this pattern in a simple way. She said, "The mind often mistakes obsession for protection. Because obsession creates the illusion of control. It feels productive. It feels necessary. It feels important. But often, it only deepens the wound." Daniel didn't realize it yet, but the betrayal was no longer controlling his life. His reaction to the betrayal was, and that reaction was growing stronger every day. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever replayed a painful event in your mind so many times that it started feeling like it was happening all over again? Let me know in the comments, because Daniel was about to take the next step, the step that would transform a painful memory into an obsession. The human mind has a strange relationship with pain. When something hurts us, we naturally believe thinking about it will help us understand it. And sometimes that's true, for a while. But there comes a point where reflection stops being useful and becomes repetition. Daniel Harris had crossed that line. At first, the thoughts about Michael appeared only occasionally. A few minutes during the morning, a few moments before sleep, an unexpected memory during lunch. But as the months passed, those moments became longer, more frequent, more intense. Without realizing it, Daniel had begun feeding the fire. Every new detail he remembered became fuel. Every unanswered question became fuel. Every imagined conversation became fuel. And the fire kept growing. One evening, Lisa found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Their daughter had already gone to bed. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. Daniel wasn't reading. He wasn't working. He wasn't watching television. He was simply staring at nothing, lost in thought. Lisa asked a simple question. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel already knew the answer. Michael. It was almost always Michael. The betrayal, the contracts, the lost money, the humiliation, the injustice. The story replayed so often that it had become automatic. Like a movie, his mind could not stop showing. And each replay felt important, necessary, urgent. But something interesting happens when we replay painful memories. Psychologists have found that the brain doesn't always distinguish between remembering an event and reliving it. The emotional response can be surprisingly similar, which means every time Daniel replayed the betrayal, his body reacted as if it were happening again. The anger returned, the frustration returned, the resentment returned, again and again and again. Months turned into years. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. New opportunities appeared. New projects emerged. New relationships formed. But Daniel struggled to see them because his attention remained fixed on the past. This is one of the hidden costs of obsession. Every minute spent staring backward is a minute not spent moving forward. But obsession rarely feels like a waste of time. It feels like preparation. Daniel convinced himself he was staying alert, learning lessons, protecting himself, making sure it never happened again. But deep down, something else was happening. The betrayal had become part of his identity. People often ask, why don't some people let things go? The answer is complicated, because sometimes letting go feels like losing. Sometimes forgiveness feels like weakness. Sometimes healing feels like surrender. And sometimes pain becomes so familiar that we don't know who we would be without it. Daniel wasn't just holding on to the betrayal. The betrayal was holding on to him. Around this time, Sarah Mitchell began studying similar behavioral patterns. She noticed something fascinating. The people who suffered the longest weren't always the ones who experienced the greatest injustice. They were often the people who revisited the injustice most frequently. Because every revisit strengthened the emotional pathway, like walking the same trail through a forest. The more you walk it, the easier it becomes to find. Daniel was building that trail every day, and eventually, it became the easiest path in his mind. By now, Michael occupied more space in Daniel's thoughts than his own future. More space than his goals. More space than his happiness. More space than his family. And that was the real danger, not revenge itself. But what revenge was slowly replacing. One afternoon, while sitting alone in his truck after work, Daniel made a discovery. He couldn't remember the last day he hadn't thought about Michael. Not one day, not 1 week, not 1 month. The thought had become permanent, and for the first time, that realization frightened him. Because somewhere deep inside, he began to wonder, what if Michael wasn't destroying my life anymore? What if I was doing that myself? But that question disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, because another thought immediately took its place. A familiar thought, a comfortable thought, a dangerous thought. One day, I'll make him pay. The human mind has a strange relationship with pain. When something hurts us, we naturally believe thinking about it will help us understand it. And sometimes that's true for a while, but there comes a point where reflection stops being useful and becomes repetition. Daniel Harris had crossed that line. At first, the thoughts about Michael appeared only occasionally, a few minutes during the morning, a few moments before sleep, an unexpected memory during lunch. But as the months passed, those moments became longer, more frequent, more intense. Without realizing it, Daniel had begun feeding the fire. Every new detail he remembered became fuel. Every unanswered question became fuel. Every imagined conversation became fuel. And the fire kept growing. One evening, Lisa found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Their daughter had already gone to bed. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. Daniel wasn't reading. He wasn't working. He wasn't watching television. He was simply staring at nothing, lost in thought. Lisa asked a simple question. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel already knew the answer. Michael. It was almost always Michael. The betrayal, the contracts, the lost money, the humiliation, the injustice. The story replayed so often that it had become automatic. Like a movie his mind could not stop showing. And each replay felt important, necessary, urgent. But something interesting happens when we replay painful memories. Psychologists have found that the brain doesn't always distinguish between remembering an event and reliving it. The emotional response can be surprisingly similar, which means every time Daniel replayed the betrayal, his body reacted as if it were happening again. The anger returned. The frustration returned. The resentment returned. Again and again and again. Months turned into years. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. New opportunities appeared. New projects emerged. New relationships formed. But Daniel struggled to see them because his attention remained fixed on the past. This is one of the hidden costs of obsession. Every minute spent staring backward is a minute not spent moving forward. But obsession rarely feels like a waste of time. It feels like preparation. Daniel convinced himself he was staying alert, learning lessons, protecting himself, making sure it never happened again. But deep down, something else was happening. The betrayal had become part of his identity. People often ask, why don't some people let things go? The answer is complicated, because sometimes letting go feels like losing. Sometimes forgiveness feels like weakness. Sometimes healing feels like surrender. And sometimes pain becomes so familiar that we don't know who we would be without it. Daniel wasn't just holding on to the betrayal. The betrayal was holding on to him. Around this time, Sarah Mitchell began studying similar behavioral patterns. She noticed something fascinating. The people who suffered the longest weren't always the ones who experienced the greatest injustice. They were often the people who revisited the injustice most frequently, because every revisit strengthened the emotional pathway. Like walking the same trail through a forest. The more you walk it, the easier it becomes to find. Daniel was building that trail every day. And eventually, it became the easiest path in his mind. By now, Michael occupied more space in Daniel's thoughts than his own future. More space than his goals. More space than his happiness. More space than his family. And that was the real danger. Not revenge itself, but what revenge was slowly replacing. One afternoon, while sitting alone in his truck after work, Daniel made a discovery. He couldn't remember the last day he hadn't thought about Michael. Not one day, not 1 week, not 1 month. The thought had become permanent. And for the first time, that realization frightened him, because somewhere deep inside, he began to wonder, what if Michael wasn't destroying my life anymore? What if I was doing that myself? But that question disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, because another thought immediately took its place. A familiar thought, a comfortable thought, a dangerous thought. One day, I'll make him pay. For years, Daniel Harris believed he was carrying a burden. But now, for the first time, he began to wonder if the burden was carrying him. The news about Michael should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt empty. For so long, Daniel had imagined that moment. The moment he would finally know what happened. The moment he would finally hear about Michael's failures, his regrets, his punishment, his downfall. But none of that happened. Michael had moved on, and that realization struck Daniel harder than the betrayal itself, because it forced him to confront a painful truth. The person who had occupied his mind for 3 years was barely thinking about him at all. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep, not because he was angry, because he was confused. For years, he had told himself a story where revenge was the answer, a story where holding on to the anger was necessary, a story where letting go meant losing. But suddenly, those ideas didn't make sense anymore. Because if revenge was supposed to protect him, why did he feel exhausted? If anger was supposed to make him stronger, why did he feel weaker? If obsession was supposed to help him heal, why was he still suffering? The questions kept coming. And, for the first time, Daniel didn't run from them. He sat with them. A few days later, he found himself looking through old family photographs. Pictures from before the betrayal, before the business collapse, before Michael. There was one photograph that stopped him. Lisa was smiling. His daughter was sitting on his shoulders. The three of them looked genuinely happy. Daniel stared at the image for several minutes. Then he realized something. He missed that man, not the younger version of himself, the present version of himself. Because somewhere along the way, he had stopped being fully present in his own life. He had attended birthdays, but wasn't really there. Gone on vacations, but wasn't really there. Shared dinners, but wasn't really there. Part of him had remained trapped in 2007, waiting for justice, waiting for revenge, waiting for something that never arrived. Sarah Mitchell later described this phenomenon in one of her lectures. She said, "Many people believe revenge is a path toward freedom. But revenge often becomes a form of attachment, because every day we carry resentment. We remain emotionally connected to the person who hurt us, not physically, emotionally. And emotional chains can last much longer than physical ones." Daniel began noticing those chains everywhere. They appeared in conversations, in quiet moments, in decisions, in memories. Michael wasn't controlling Daniel anymore, but the resentment was. And resentment had become a full-time job. One afternoon, while sitting alone by the water near Seattle's harbor, Daniel finally asked himself a question he had avoided for years. What has this cost me? The answer arrived faster than he expected. Time, peace, presence, connection, joy, moments with his daughter, moments with Lisa, moments that would never return. And suddenly, the betrayal looked different, not smaller, but different, because Daniel realized something profound. Michael had taken a few years of his career, but Daniel had given away years of his life, freely, voluntarily, one thought at a time. That realization hurt, but it also created something new, responsibility. For years, Daniel had blamed Michael for everything. Now, he could finally see a distinction. Michael caused the wound, but Daniel had been reopening it again and again and again. And once he saw that truth, he could no longer unsee it. The revenge story was beginning to crack. The prison walls were beginning to break. And for the first time in years, Daniel started considering a possibility that once seemed impossible. Maybe letting go wasn't surrender. Maybe letting go was freedom. And that possibility would change everything. Most people believe this story is about betrayal. Some people believe it's about revenge. But Sarah Mitchell disagreed. After reviewing hundreds of similar cases, she reached a different conclusion. This story was never really about Michael Reed. It was never really about business. And it wasn't even about revenge. It was about attention. Because whatever receives our attention receives our life. And for nearly 3 years, Daniel Harris had been giving his life away, one thought at a time, one memory at a time, one resentment at a time. Sarah called this the revenge loop, a psychological cycle that traps people without them realizing it. It usually begins with a wound, a betrayal, a humiliation, a loss, something painful, something unfair, something that feels impossible to forget. Then comes the second stage, rumination. The mind replays the event again and again and again, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it hopes repetition will somehow create understanding. Then comes the third stage, identity. The person slowly begins defining themselves through the wound, not consciously, subconsciously. Daniel was no longer just a husband, a father, a builder, a professional. Part of his identity had become the man who was betrayed, and that identity became difficult to release. Because if he let go of the pain, who would he become? The final stage is the most dangerous. Attachment. The person becomes emotionally attached to the very thing causing suffering. Not because they like it, because it becomes familiar. And familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. That realization changed Daniel. Not overnight, not dramatically. Real change rarely works that way. Instead, it began with something very small. Awareness. For the first time, Daniel started noticing when Michael entered his thoughts. Noticing the pattern. Noticing the trigger. Noticing how often the same story repeated itself. And once he saw the pattern, he could no longer ignore it. Weeks later, he made a decision. A simple decision. A quiet decision. A powerful decision. He stopped feeding the fire. Not because Michael deserved forgiveness. Not because what happened was acceptable. Not because justice no longer mattered. But because Daniel finally understood something. Holding on to the anger wasn't hurting Michael. It was hurting Daniel. The revenge had never reached its target. It had only reached its host. Months passed. Then more months. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still difficult days. Still painful memories. Still moments when old emotions returned. But something was different. The thoughts no longer controlled him. They visited. Then they left. And that made all the difference. One evening, Daniel sat on the back porch with Lisa, watching the sunset. Their daughter was playing in the yard, laughing, running, living completely in the present moment. Daniel watched her quietly, then smiled. A real smile, the kind he hadn't felt in years. And in that moment, he realized something. Michael Reed had taken part of his past, but only Daniel could give away his future. And finally, he stopped doing that. Sarah Mitchell later summarized the entire case in one sentence, a sentence that eventually became famous among behavioral analysts. She said, "The person trapped by revenge is rarely the target. It's usually the thinker." Case file number 003. The man who couldn't stop thinking about revenge. Closed. But before we close this file completely, I want to ask you something. Have you ever carried anger longer than the person who caused it? Have you ever replayed a painful memory so many times that it became part of your identity? Let me know in the comments. Your story might help someone else who is still trapped inside their own revenge loop. And if you enjoy exploring the psychology behind human behavior, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because next time we'll open case file number 004. The story of a single lie. A lie that seemed harmless at first. A lie that grew, spread, and eventually changed multiple lives forever. Case file number 004. How one lie became a crime. Coming next.